All right, so we've got a couple people joining now, which is awesome. And just a little bit about me. If you've ever joined any of the Halstead webinars before, I'm sure you've seen me. I'm the Community and Education Manager here at Halstead, and I have a background in jewelry making. I have a BFA and an MFA in jewelry and metals, and thank you, Elaine, for commenting on my glasses. My theory is if you have to wear them all the time, they might as well be cute. So I've got a background in jewelry making, and I've been here with Halstead for 2 years now, doing lots of our online education and things like that. So we are going to get started. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a pre-recorded video here on tube setting. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat. Make sure to change your chat settings to everyone. So if you have questions, we can all see them. I'll answer questions in the chat as they come in, but then we'll also have a little bit of time for questions at the end if you have anything. Hey everyone, Sylvie here, and in this session we are going to be talking about tube settings. So I'm going to discuss 2 different ways to tube set. The first one is by using pre-made, pre-cut tube bezel settings from Halstead, which make your life a lot easier. And then the second way is by cutting the seat yourself in a piece of heavy wall tubing. And you're pretty much only going to use that method if you need something a little bit special and a little bit different. Typically, it's for height variation. Otherwise, using the pre-made ones are really the way to go because they take all the worry out of tube setting. So what I've done is we're going to be creating this little stone spattered pendant, and I've just soldered all of my little tube settings onto a 30 millimeter link, and that's S5444 is the larger circle that I've used here, and I've soldered on a jump ring SJ855, which is a 20 gauge 5.5 millimeter jump ring. And when I'm ready to loop this onto my chain or cord or whatnot, I'll just put another jump ring through that loop. And I've got all my settings on here. So I've used 2, 3, and 4 millimeter tube bezel settings, which can be found at S5022, S5023, and S5024. And the way that I created this is I soldered all of these tubes on by pick soldering them. So I flexed everything, I lined it all up, and then I came in with my pick with solder on it and placed it at each joint and float it. If you'd like to pre-place your solder beforehand, that's totally fine. You risk moving the bezels around a little bit less when you do that, but pick soldering is pretty natural for me, so that's the way that I went with it. But feel free to use whatever method is easiest for you. And so before we get started, what I've done is I've already soldered all these on here so that you don't have to watch me do that, because that's not what we're here for today. We're here for the setting part of it. So there's going to be 2 ways that you can set tube settings. And typically you're going to be using faceted stones in tube settings. I'm using stones from Halstead's CZ series, which come in a variety of colors and sizes, and I've picked a bunch of fun colors for this piece that we're going to use today. So there's 2 ways, like I said, that you can actually set it. You can use pre-made punches that fit perfectly over the tube. So I've got a 4 millimeter and a 3 millimeter here, and you can see that they fit right over my 4 millimeter tube and right over my 3 millimeter tube. So that's nice and perfect. And then what I would do is I would take a chasing hammer, give it a couple taps, and that folds over that metal on the tube and clamps my stone in. So when you're choosing what hammer to use for that, just make sure it's one that you don't mind marring up the face of. Chasing hammers are designed to be used with metal tools, so it's not something that we worry about, but just make sure that you don't use your planishing hammer or something that you want a nice shiny face on. The other way to set tube settings is by using a bezel pusher. So I just have, it's just a piece of steel that's semi-polished, it's flat with broken edges, and so I'll use this with my chasing hammer if you don't have these pre-made punches, and it works just as good. You can also buy sets that have a variety of different sizes in one box, and you can change out the handle, and this gives you a large variety that you can use for whatever size tubing you're using. So I've got all my settings soldered on, and we'll just do a close-up of one of these settings just so you can see that I've got the seat already cut. They come that way, which is amazing because it takes any of the worry out of doing it myself. I don't have to worry about being perfectly up and down. They've already done that for me. I know that it's super level, and I also know that the height of the tube is deep enough to accommodate my stone. So I don't have to worry about that either, which is really nice. So we won't have any sharp Q-lits pointing out the back of our piece because these are pre-sized for 4mm stones, 3mm, 2mm, whatever size it is. They're perfectly sized so that you don't have to worry about any of that. So I'm going to start with the 4mm stones just because they're a bit bigger and easier for me to hold. So I've just popped that in there. And the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that I look at this from all directions. So front, side, etc., because I want to make sure that my stone is level. And so I can tweak that with my fingernail. Sometimes pushing it against my bench pin will straighten it out or make it worse like I just did. But you can pop them out and put them back in as many times as you want to make sure that you've got that stone perfectly level. Because it's really easy to put it in a little bit angled, and you know that if the stone's not level, then it's a human error because the seat's already cut for us, so we don't have to worry about that. So that's just a matter of just spending a little bit of time to just get it perfect. One thing you can also use too is a beeswax stick. So mine's pretty dirty at this point because I've used it a lot, but it's just a glob of beeswax that's on a little rod or dowel, and you can use that to pick up your stone and put it in a little bit more level. All right, so now that I've got that nice and level, I can get setting. And any wax that you might have on there from your wax stick is really easy to just wipe off with your finger. All right, so that's nice and level. So I'm gonna put this on my bench pin that's about as sturdy as I need to. It does not need to be on a steel block. And I'm going to take my 4mm tube punch, and I'm going to pop it right over, and I'm going to give this a couple good taps with my chasing hammer. And And what I've done there at the end is I've angled it just a little bit, north, south, east, west. And what that's done is really just making sure that I've got it closed down all around my stone. And you can kind of tap it around in a little bit of a circle too if you'd like. And now we can see that the edges of my tube have now curled over my stone. So those straight edges have now gone like this, and what they've done is locked my stone in so it's not coming out. And now I can take any of my favorite polishing wheels and brighten that top edge up, and it is done. Now, if you don't have these handy punches, like I said, not to worry. We can use a stone pusher. So this one's made out of steel. You can make your own out of brass if you'd like. If you're using silver settings, brass is totally fine. It will wear down faster than the steel, but it will be enough. So what I like to do for those is I want to make sure that I secure my piece in some way. So I'm just going to use double stick tape or have tape with the sticky side face up. Anything like that to stick in is gonna be enough. If you have something like jet set or a thermoplastic that you can lock around it, you can use that. This is personal preference. I like the tape because it's easy and it's pretty cheap. So I just have some gaffer's tape here. So I'm just gonna take a piece, put it upside down, and I'm gonna tape that down to my bench pin so that that doesn't move around. That's why double stick tape is really nice, because it just tapes to your bench pin, and then you've got sticky side facing up already. And the reason that you need something to hold your piece when you're using this method is because you're using both hands to hold tools and you're going at an angle. So we don't want that piece to move. We want it to be sturdy enough that there's resistance of that tool against the metal. So now I'm going to get my piece aligned and I'm going to stick it down, and we can see right here that it is not going anywhere, which is awesome. So I'm going to grab my next stone and pop it in there. Still always checking to make sure that we're nice and level. All right, that looks good. So the way that we're going to set this with our punch and our chasing hammer is the way that we often set many stones. We're going to work in that north, south, east, west directionality. And what that does is it makes sure that we're keeping our stone level while we're setting it. So I'm going to hold my punch at about a 45-degree angle to my bezel edge and give it a few taps. And what that is going to do is going to start to lock down one side of my tube bezel. But I did notice that my stone moved a little bit while doing that. So I just want to make sure to get that lined back up. Okay, so that's lined back up. Sometimes it's just a matter of pushing it down with the back end of my tweezers or a little piece of wood or something like that. And now I'm going to come across from the last one that I did and give it a tap or two at that 45-degree angle. And then I'll start working east-west as well. So coming in from the sides. And then the next thing I'll do is work in between my north, south, east, west. I'm always working across from the last punch that I did to make sure that I'm working evenly. And my tool is at a 45-degree angle to my bezel edge. And I'm not hitting very hard, just gently. And once I've got the majority of that bezel locked down, I can just move around in a gentle circle and even out any high points. All right, I'm gonna pop this off of my tape. Comes off really easily, and give that a look. Just want to make sure that my bezel is even and that I don't have any high spots, which we look pretty good. And so with that method, you may need to do a little bit extra cleanup. Take a medium to fine silicone wheel to clean up any marks that may have come from your setting tool, or if it's just a little uneven, you're just gonna clean that up, and then you can polish it just like you would if you were using one of your setting punches. So both methods work great. One is not better than the other. It is personal preference or whatever tools that you may have on hand. And it works exactly the same for the smaller stones. So I'm going to finish up setting all of these with you, and we're going to blast through them. You don't need to watch them in real time, but I just want to show you how easy it is using the pre-made settings. So I'm just going to finish setting these up, and I'm going to use the punches because I have them, and they do tend to be a bit quicker and a bit cleaner. So let's set the rest of them. Okay, so now we have just one stone left to set. I'm gonna pop that in there. Make sure we're even. Okay, and we are ready to set. Pop my tool over, and give it a couple good taps. And there we are. We've got all of our stone set, and although we've sped that up for you and cut out some parts because you don't need to watch me do that in real time, the whole thing was pretty quick, and I was able to get all of those done relatively efficiently because I didn't have to worry about cutting any of the seats. I didn't have to worry about the height of them, filing flat on the top, none of that. All that was done for me. So now all I would do is polish up the edges around each stone, make them nice and bright and shiny. It just really helps make them pop. And then I can slide this onto whatever chain or cord I would like. So that's using pre-made, pre-cut tube bezel settings. And the next way that we are going to tube set is by cutting your own seats. Okay, so when it comes to cutting your own seat or making your own tube bezel settings, like I said, the reason that you really only are ever going to want to do that is if you need something special. So in this instance of this cuff, I just wanted a little bit of a height variation in my settings to make this top part a little bit more dynamic and just to give it a little bit more life. So that's what I'm going to be demonstrating today. And then I've mixed in some of the pre-cut, pre-made settings because I didn't need those to be a different height. So I've got my bracelet ready to go for the settings. And what I like to do is I like to create my settings while they are not attached to my piece. You can do that if you'd like. So you would cut your tube to the correct height, solder it on, and then cut the seat. But I find that to be a little bit more difficult. And if you have settings in intricate places, it can be difficult to get in with the burr to cut that seat and make sure that it's really nice and upright. So that's why I like to do them before they get soldered onto my final piece. So to do that, I have just a piece of heavy wall tubing. They typically come in 1 foot lengths. So what you really want to make sure to do is buy heavy wall tubing. So the reason that we buy heavy wall tubing is because I'm going to come in here and cut a seat into that wall of the tubing. And what that's going to do is going to create a nice little area for my stone to sit, and it's going to look kind of like that. It's got straight sides and an angled bottom, and so my stone will fit perfectly right in that little seat that I cut. So I am working with 2mm stones is what I purchased. So the first thing that you always want to do when cutting your own seats is to make sure that you measure absolutely everything. So although the CZs from Halstead are amazing and they're calibrated, and I know it's going to be pretty darn close to 2mm, I want to make sure to measure that just in case. So measuring that, and we've got 2.01. Oh, yep, 2 on the dot actually. So that's pretty perfect. And the tubing that I'm going to be using is 2.6mm. And you always want to purchase tubing that is about 1/2 millimeter larger than the stone that you're using. If it's heavy wall tubing like we want, we can guarantee that our tube wall width is going to add that extra 1/2 millimeter, and it gives us enough metal to cut into. So if I come in here and measure one of those walls, we've got about 1/2 millimeter. So I know I've got the right size tubing for my stone. If we were using a 3mm stone, we would size up to a 3.5mm heavy wall tube so that we've got enough space to cut our seat. So the first thing that we want to do right now is we want to make sure that the top of this piece of tubing is nice and square to the wall. And the way that I'm going to do that is by using a miter block or a miter jig. And what this tool does is typically there's two slots. There's a 90-degree slot and a 45-degree slot. So I'm going to open it up and pop my tubing into the 90-degree one because that's what we want. And I'm just going to have it sticking above the edge of the block ever so slightly. I don't want any of my tube below the block because I'm going to use the block as my guide for filing that flat, but I also don't want to file off any more than I need because that's wasted material. So tighten that up, and then I'm going to take my file and I'm just going to run it along the top of that block until my tube is even with the block. And that can create a little burr at the edge of your tube. So I'm just lightly filing that off. Okay, so now that I've got the top of my tubing nice and perpendicular to the wall of it, I'm ready to cut the seat. So I've got my stone here that I'm going to keep readily available because I need to test fit as I'm cutting this seat. And the tool that I'm going to use to cut the seat is a setting burr. And setting burrs have that shape of a straight wall with an angled tip. And I want to pick the size setting burr that most closely matches my stone. So I'm going to pick a 2mm setting burr. So let's give that a measure. And I am measuring 1.96. So that's pretty close. I can easily open that up just a little bit. It's always better to err on the side that's just a smidge smaller than your stone because you can open it up yourself. So I've got my setting burr, my stone, and my tubing. I'm going to pop my burr into my flex shaft. And now this is personal preference too, but when I'm cutting seats, I like to wear optivisors because it makes everything really clear and it's going to be a lot easier for me to see where my stone top is in conjunction in relation to the top of my tubing and all of that. So I've got my optivisors here and I'm using 7 magnification, but that's all dependent on how good your eyes are or how bad they are. So when I am setting, the first thing that I want to make sure to do is lubricate my burr. That will help everything go a lot smoother. Just a little bit. I'm going to lower my chair so that I'm at a better height. And I'm going to set my tubing up in this little notch that I've got on my bench pin. And I'm going to make sure that it's nice and stable in there. And then when I come in with my tool, I'm going to come in straight up and down. I want to be as perpendicular and upright as I can be because that's going to mean that our seat is even more even. So I'm going to pop my visors down so I can see better and cut that seat. And you can see I did not go in very far that first time. I'm going to be doing a lot of back and forth of checking my tubing with my stone. So I just came in a little bit and I did turn that tubing once while I was setting just to account for slight variations in hand placement. So I'm going to grab my stone, pop it into my setting, and come down here and take a look. All right, we're not all the way in there yet, and it definitely looks like it's still way too high. What we're looking for is the top of that stone to be about level or just above the edge of the tubing. And if you remember when we measured our burr, it was just a little bit smaller than our stone. So to account for that, we're going to take our burr in this round of cutting and we're going to move it around the outside of the tube. And what that's going to do is just widen our setting just a little bit. We only want to make sure to do that once or twice because we don't want to open it too much. We want that to still be a really good snug fit. Right. So I opened it up a little bit and I pushed down just a little bit because I knew that my stone still wasn't at the right level. Pop it in, take a look. Okay, so I can see that my seat looks fairly even here. But my stone's still just a bit too high. It's sitting up a little bit higher than I would like. So I'm going to come down in and do one more round of seat cutting. Okay. Pop that in there. And I can push this against my bench pin or use the end of my tweezers just to make sure that it's in there all the way. Looks like my stone's a little bit crooked right now. And one thing that's really handy to have while you're doing this, because right now my wax is not sticking to my stone, is just a long piece of wire that will fit in your tube so you can pop the stone out from the other side if you need to. So I'll get this fit in there again to see if we are good or not, if we're straight, uneven, whatever. And that's why, unless I really need to, I prefer to use the pre-cut ones because you can see that this process takes a lot longer because it is a lot of back and forth between cutting my seat and checking my stone. So now I'm going to take a look at my visors and it looks like I'm a little crooked still. So I'm going to make sure to come in on this round of cutting to make sure that I angle in the direction that was a little high. And I did that really fast. Those burrs cut a decent amount of material fairly quickly, so we always want to move in small amounts so that we don't overdo it. And that is looking pretty good. And as we can see, the table of our stone, or the very top, is just ever so slightly sticking out the top of our tube. Very barely. So that is what we are looking for. Awesome. So now I'm going to take my stone out and I'm going to cut it to the height that I want the tube to be. And the best way to do that is to use a tube cutting jig. The first thing I'm going to do is mark my tube with how tall or long I want that piece of tubing to be. Okay, so I'm just going to mark this with a Sharpie about where I want it. That looks pretty good. And this is a tube cutting jig. They're really handy because if you just tried to cut this with your saw on your fingers, the tubing is most likely going to spin. And what this does is it keeps it nice and locked in. So what I can do is I can loosen this up and I can move this. So that means I can set this stopper to the length that I want my tubing to be. If you needed to cut multiples of the same size, it's super handy for that. All right, and what I'm doing is I'm lining my Sharpie mark up with this slit right here, and that's where my saw blade is going to go. So I'm going to tighten that up, pop my tubing in, flip this little notch over, and what that does is it's going to lock my tubing in and allow me to put my saw right down this slit and cut my tubing. Okay, and that pops through. And now I've got my tube and I've got the seat on one side and the other side is flat, or what I want to be flat. So I'm going to pop it back into my miter block with the cut side facing up. And I'm just going to file that flat so I know that when I go to solder it to something, it's got a really nice connection point. All right, and that is how you make your own tube settings. So you can see that one versus one of these pre-made, pre-cut ones from Halstead that I just shot across the room. And you can see the height difference in these, but otherwise they look pretty similar. But it did take me a lot longer to make this one. So we've got those two just to show you the difference of if you make your own versus if you purchase them. And the reason that I wanted to make my own for this piece was so that it had a little bit more movement going on that top. I wanted a little bit more height variation. And now we will move on to the setting portion, which is essentially exactly the same as when we set the pre-made and pre-cut ones. I'm going to use the same bezel punches or chasing hammer and setting tool that I used before, whatever method, like I said, you prefer. But instead of using my bench pin, I'm going to use a wooden bracelet mandrel to support my piece because we always want that piece supported underneath. So I'm going to slide this on, and now I can use the wood to support any hammering that I need to do on this piece for when I'm setting my stones. So I'll get this set up and we'll set those stones together. All right, so now we're ready to set these stones, and like I said, we're going to do it in the exact same way that we did them on the pendant piece. So I'm going to get my punches ready. I'm just using 3mm and 2mm settings for this one. For the cuff piece, I used one of Halstead's pre-made cuffs, which is SCF 182. It's 18 gauge, 6 inches long, so it gives you plenty of length for a variety of sizes. And then the pre-made settings that I used was S5023 for the 3mm and S5022 for the 2mm, plus some of that heavy wall tubing that I used to make my own. So I'm going to grab my CZs And pop that in there. And same as the other pieces, I want to make sure that my CZ is nice and level in my setting before I set it. All right. And now with this, it's a little bit trickier in just the sense of we really have to kind of pay attention of where we have that bracelet in relation to the mandrel, because we want to make sure that there's contact. We don't want any air behind our cuff, between the cuff and the mandrel. So we may have to move it around a little bit just so that we make sure that we get that good contact to support the hammering. And one good indicator of that is sound. So that was kind of like a hearty, that was a hearty sound, let's put it that way. If it was a little bit higher pitched and kind of a little bit more open sounding, then we'd know that we weren't really getting contact. All right, so we've got one setting down. And now when we go to set our settings that were higher and the ones that we made ourselves, no difference. We're going to do that exactly the same way. Make sure that my stone is level. There we go. Going to find that sweet spot of that bracelet in relation to my mandrel and come in here with my punches and make sure that we've got that guy set in. That one's a little bit small, so we'll make sure to use this one. Okay. Now I'm just going to keep moving through the rest of these stones in the exact same way. And now we are going and setting our last stone. Pop that guy in there. Double check that we're level. Make sure we've got good support from our mandrel. And we are done. So you'll notice with this piece that I did the patina before I set the stones. The stones are typically going to be the last thing that you want to do. CZs will not be affected by liver of sulfur, but whatever stone you're using may be a little bit porous. It may change color if you're adding a patina. So that's why stone setting is typically the last thing you're going to do. And the nice thing with blackening this piece was when I was going through that process, my brass brush helped get in between those bezels and clean up those interior areas. So I had a nice even finish. And what I did to create this piece was first I curved my cuff blank. I made sure that that was the size and shape that I wanted before I soldered any of these tubes on, because once these are on, to try and hammer that nice and flat and evenly wouldn't really work out because you would do that with a rawhide mallet. And if we took our rawhide mallet and came in here, those tubes are getting in the way of us making full contact with that piece of sheet metal. So that's why I made sure to curve my cuff before I soldered these on. If we had a more extreme curve, this is fairly gentle at the top here, but if we had a more extreme curve for the larger bezels, I may consider putting a gentle curve on the bottom of those with just a half round file so that I had really, really good contact. But because this was pretty flat, I didn't need to do that. And then I came in and I placed my tubes, set them up, and then I just put a little tiny piece of solder at each tube, and I heated the whole thing and heated from underneath and got those to flow, and that's how I soldered this piece. You could come in and pick solder if you want to, but I find that pre-placing on a piece like this where I've got a nice large surface to support my solder is a lot easier than pick soldering in this instance. So we're done. That is 2 ways to tube set faceted stones. One is using pre-cut, pre-made bezel settings like the ones from Halstead, or cutting your own seat. And like I said, typically you're only going to do that if you need a variation in height for whatever reason, because the other ones are perfectly sized and they're machine made, so it takes out all the human error so that you know your stones are going to be even, level, and perfect. So thanks for watching. Be sure to show us what you make with your tube settings by sharing on various platforms. You can find us at Halstead Jewelry Supplies. We hope to see you there. Thanks. Okay, thank you for joining, everybody. Kelly put a bunch of links in the chat already to tube settings and things like that that we used. And for any of the tools, we recommend Guess Wine. They're a great company for tools, and they're really helpful if you call their customer service as well if you have questions about anything. And then, as Kelly said, if you have any additional questions about tube setting, feel free to pop them in the chat and I will answer them now live. So I'll just hang out for a little minute if anybody has any questions. And if we don't have any questions, we have a little bit of a break before the next session, which will be best practices for stone sourcing with Judy Powers. And that's going to be a great session, jam-packed with information. Definitely one that you might want to watch the recording a few times. So, okay, we've got a question. How do you handle gold filled solder to gold filled? So, soldering gold fill can be a little tricky. It's something that we tend not to recommend too often because it's very easy to overheat it while soldering. and then you alloy that layer of gold and brass together, and then it's not coated in 14 karat gold anymore. So having really good torch control and soldering skills is definitely something that we recommend for using gold fill. You're going to want to match your carat solder. So if you're using 14 karat gold filled, you use 14 karat gold solder. There is no gold filled solder. And then if possible, we do recommend plating after soldering with gold fill, so that if you did alloy anything together, it covers that, and it also hides your solder seam so that it blends visually better, because there will always be a little bit of a color difference there. So Kelly just popped a link to a blog that gives a lot more detailed information about soldering gold fill that would be useful to read over if it's something that you're interested in experimenting with. It's definitely doable. It just requires a little bit more skill and torch control. So if we don't have, okay. Unfortunately, the chat is not available in the recording, but all of the questions, this part of it totally is. Alexa says, I noticed you worked with the tube in length before you cut it. Sometimes having a tube so long bumps making working with it awkward. Yes, it definitely can. You are more than welcome to cut your tube to length first, like the final length that you want it. You can cut it to that first, and then put the tube in a miter jig to cut the seat to hold it if it's too short. My tube wasn't too long that it got in the way. Typically, when you buy tubing like that, it will come in 12-inch lengths, and it's very rare that it comes longer than that. And I found that that's pretty workable for me, but if you want to, you can absolutely cut it to length first, put it in something to hold it, then cut your seat, and then solder it onto whatever you choose to put it onto. Great question. All right, if we don't have any more chats, any more questions, as I'm looking at the chat. If we don't have any more questions, we'll take a little bit of a break before the next session. Y'all can grab a snack or whatnot. And then we will be back in about a half an hour for Judy's session on best practices for stone sourcing. So we'll see you there. Thanks for joining. Bye.